When the private jet belonging to Chief Executive Sloan Carrington prepared for takeoff, an urgent technical call was unexpectedly routed to Owen Barrett, a single father repairing an air conditioning unit in a rented apartment building. After only a few seconds of listening to a vibration echoing through the phone, Owen told the pilot to shut down the engine immediately. The executives on board laughed, calling him an unemployed repairman searching for attention. But when Owen recited the exact serial number of the failing component, every pilot across the entire fleet refused to take off. What followed would tear apart a corporate empire built on a lie and force the most powerful woman in private aviation to trust the one man she had once been told to forget. Press subscribe now to follow Owen as he uncovers a secret capable of saving an entire fleet and bringing down the people who once tried to destroy his life. Owen Barrett spent his mornings inside crawl spaces and utility closets, coaxing tired compressors back to life for landlords who barely remembered his name. He wore a gray work shirt permanently marked with grease, and he drove a pickup truck whose maintenance had been deferred longer than he liked to admit. None of this reflected what he actually knew. 2 years earlier, Owen had been one of the most respected vibration and reliability engineers in private aviation, the man who could hear a mechanical failure forming before any sensor registered it. Now he fixed window units in a suburb outside Dallas, and he told himself that was simply what providing for a daughter looked like. His daughter, Laurel, called him that afternoon to ask whether he would make it home in time for dinner. Owen said he would try, keeping to himself the conversation he'd had that morning with a landlord demanding overdue rent. He climbed into the truck bed to gather his tools, already calculating how many more service calls he needed before the month closed out. He had built a quiet, careful life around never mentioning the career he'd lost, and never explaining why. It was easier that way, and easier still to believe the past had stayed buried. Owen had learned to live inside a smaller version of himself, one that fit neatly into work orders and service tickets instead of technical reports and certification hearings. He kept a single photograph tucked inside his truck's glove compartment, a picture of himself standing beside a jet engine years earlier, wearing a company badge that no longer existed anywhere except in that faded image. Neighbors in the apartment complex knew him only as the quiet man who fixed their appliances without complaint and never charged more than he had to. None of them knew that the same steady hands now tightening a bolt on a rattling condenser unit had once signed off on safety protocols protecting hundreds of passengers a day. He preferred it that way, mostly because remembering what he had lost still carried a weight he wasn't ready to set down in front of anyone, not even Laurel. At Carrington Crown Aviation's private terminal, the jet designated Carrington Crown Alpha 1 was being prepared for a flight that would carry Chief Executive Sloan Carrington to the announcement of the largest fleet expansion in company history. Captain Reed Lawson walked the final checks himself, the way he always had, though on this evening something felt wrong beneath his boots before it ever reached his ears. A low, steady vibration pulsed from somewhere behind the electrical bay, faint enough that a passenger would never notice, but familiar enough that Reed's stomach tightened. The technical center told him it was ordinary resonance, a byproduct of the recent systems upgrade, and nothing worth delaying departure over. Reed did not believe them. He had flown with an engineer once who could diagnose a fault by ear alone, a man whose warnings had always proven correct even when nobody wanted to hear them. That man's name was Owen Barrett, and Reed still had his personal number written in the back of an old flight log he kept out of habit. Standing near the open service hatch, Reed dialed the number from the jet's satellite phone, uncertain whether it would even connect after all this time. Owen almost let the call go to voicemail, assuming it was another sales pitch aimed at homeowners. When Reed identified himself and said he was standing inside Carrington Crown Alpha 1, Owen went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with surprise at hearing an old colleague's voice. That aircraft was the very jet that had ended his career 2 years earlier, the one built around a system he had once refused to certify. Reed held the phone close to the bulkhead so Owen could listen, and for several seconds neither man spoke. Owen asked him to shut down the cabin air conditioning, cut the auxiliary power, then bring each system back online separately and in isolation. The vibration did not disappear the way ordinary resonance would have. Instead, it reshaped itself into 3 distinct pulses, evenly spaced, a pattern Owen recognized instantly from a testing program the company had quietly buried. It was the exact signature that had appeared before the Helix 9 power transfer unit failed under sustained load, the failure Owen had tried to report before anyone would listen. "Do not let that aircraft leave the ground," Owen said, his voice flat and certain in a way that startled even him. Reed asked whether the warning applied only to Alpha 1 or to something larger. Owen told him that if the rest of the fleet shared the same configuration, then none of them were safe to fly, not tonight, and not until someone opened the panel and looked. The call from the cockpit was quickly patched through the aircraft's internal communication system, and Sloane Carrington heard an unfamiliar man's voice instructing her own pilot to ground her own jet. Executive Vice President Gideon Wexler was seated near the front cabin, and the moment he heard the name Owen Barrett, his expression shifted from mild irritation to something colder. He told Sloane the caller was a disgruntled former employee, a man dismissed for failing to meet basic professional standards, and certainly not someone whose opinion belonged anywhere near tonight's launch. Owen did not argue about his past. He asked Reed to read back the serial number stamped on the Helix 9 power transfer unit installed in the aircraft's electrical bay. That number matched a batch Owen had flagged years earlier for a fault involving hairline cracking at the contact terminals under prolonged vibration, a defect he had documented in writing more than once. Gideon insisted every component on the jet carried full certification and told the captain to end the call immediately, his tone sharpening with each word. Owen asked Reed to hold the phone near the electrical panel while cycling the auxiliary power one more time. A faint crackling sound preceded the pulsing vibration, subtle but unmistakable to anyone trained to listen for it. Owen identified it immediately as unstable electrical discharge, not the harmless mechanical hum Gideon kept insisting it was. Gideon mocked the idea that a man currently repairing air conditioners could diagnose an $80 million aircraft over a satellite phone from somewhere outside Dallas. Sloane herself was skeptical, yet something about Owen's manner unsettled her more than Gideon's confidence did. He was not asking for money, not threatening anyone, not trying to draw the call out longer than necessary. He simply wanted the power cut and a specific location inside the electrical bay inspected before anyone attempted takeoff. Reed, invoking a captain's authority over safety, refused to fly, and within minutes word of the warning had reached every other pilot scheduled that evening. All 13 remaining jets in the Carrington Crown fleet used the identical Helix 9 configuration. When operations management pressured the pilots to proceed on schedule anyway, every captain independently demanded an inspection before departure. One by one, the entire fleet was grounded on the tarmac, and corporate flights, cargo transfers, and investor meetings across 3 time zones ground to a halt within the hour. Gideon warned that Owen would personally answer for every dollar lost if his warning proved false, his voice rising for the first time that night. Sloane made a decision of her own. She ordered a car sent to bring Owen directly to the airport, not out of gratitude, but because she intended to make him prove, in person and under scrutiny, every word he had just spoken into a stranger's phone. Sloane had spent her entire adult life inside the world her family built, and she had learned early that confidence, once projected loudly enough, was often mistaken for certainty by the people around her. Tonight, though, Something about the stranger's voice on the phone had cut through that practiced confidence in a way she found difficult to dismiss. She did not trust Owen Barrett, not yet, but she trusted her own instincts enough to know that dismissing him outright, the way Gideon so badly wanted her to, might be the more dangerous mistake. As she waited for the car to return with him, she found herself replaying the strange, steady certainty in his voice, wondering what kind of man spoke that plainly about grounding a fleet worth hundreds of millions of dollars without once raising his voice. The company car arrived at Owen's apartment complex before he'd had any chance to change out of his work clothes, still marked with the day's grease and dust. He called Laurel from the back seat to tell her he would be late, choosing his words carefully so she wouldn't hear the nervousness underneath them. She asked if everything was all right, and Owen told her it was, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true as the airport lights came into view through the window. When he reached the private terminal, security refused to let him through the main entrance and directed him instead toward the cargo access door reserved for deliveries and maintenance crews. Owen said nothing about the slight, though the irony of it settled somewhere behind his ribs as he walked past pallets of catering supplies toward the hangar. Former colleagues who once worked beside him now glanced away or offered only pitying looks as he passed, none of them willing to acknowledge the man who had once led their reliability program. A few, he noticed, watched him a little longer than the others, as though some part of them remembered exactly why he had left, and were not entirely comfortable with how that departure had been explained at the time. Inside the main hangar, Sloan, Gideon, the technical board, and several investor representatives were already assembled, waiting. Gideon introduced Owen to the room as a former employee dismissed for what he called professional instability, a label chosen specifically to strip away any credibility before Owen spoke a single word. He was then asked, in front of dozens of engineers who had built their careers at Carrington Crown, why he believed he alone understood something the entire technical staff had missed. Owen did not claim superior skill or insult anyone's competence. He simply began to explain, calmly and without embellishment, exactly what he had heard over that phone call. The Helix 9 unit relied on a composite contact terminal prone to developing microscopic cracks under a very specific vibration frequency, cracks invisible to the eye but detectable through sound and electrical behavior. As those cracks widened, current did not fail outright but flickered intermittently, producing the faint crackling sound just before the system switched to backup power. Standard diagnostic software often missed this entirely because voltage readings stayed within an acceptable average range even as the underlying fault worsened. Sloan asked directly what could happen once the aircraft was airborne and the fault continued unnoticed. Owen explained that the plane would not necessarily fall from the sky, but that several backup systems could switch at the wrong moment, stripping pilots of critical instrument data and control over key functions during precisely the wrong second of flight. Gideon reminded the room that Owen no longer held any professional certification at Carrington Crown or anywhere else in the industry. Owen replied quietly that the laws of physics did not change based on a man's job title. Technicians opened the electrical bay of the grounded aircraft but found no obvious signs of burning or damage visible to the naked eye. Gideon declared that Owen had triggered a company-wide crisis based on nothing more than a strange noise heard through a phone speaker. Owen asked instead for an inspection of the grounding wire located behind the power transfer cluster, an area difficult to see without disassembling several surrounding panels. A technician working carefully through the housing noticed the insulation there had discolored slightly, a subtle sign easy to overlook unless someone knew precisely where to search. Gideon dismissed it as ordinary wear consistent with normal aging of the material. Owen requested a controlled test, replicating the exact load and vibration frequency the aircraft had experienced just before departure that evening. Sloan granted him exactly 2 hours to prove his warning true, warning him plainly that failure would mean a lawsuit for every dollar lost across a fleet grounded worldwide because of him. The room emptied slowly as the 2-hour window began, though a handful of engineers lingered near the hangar doors, unwilling to admit they were curious about what the man in the grease-stained work shirt might actually find. Rowe watched from a distance with his arms folded, clearly uncomfortable being asked to assist someone he had spent 2 years being told to forget. Gideon remained close by as well, not out of concern for the outcome, but because he wanted to be standing there the moment Owen's warning collapsed under its own weight. Sloan retreated briefly to her office, staring out at the grounded fleet lined up along the tarmac, each aircraft representing a piece of the empire she had spent her career defending, now sitting motionless because of one phone call she still didn't fully understand. Owen built the test rig himself using equipment already stored inside the hangar, working with a focus that made several engineers in the room fall silent, despite themselves. His hands moved with a familiarity that surprised even him, muscle memory returning after 2 years spent mostly on furnace filters and thermostat wiring. Chief Technical Officer Calvin Rowe objected loudly, pointing out that Owen no longer had any authorized access to company systems or components. Sloan overruled him and ordered Rowe to assist directly, though she insisted the entire process remain under camera surveillance from start to finish, unwilling to give Gideon any later opportunity to claim the test had been staged or manipulated. Owen reproduced the electrical load and set the vibration frequency to match what Reed had described from the cockpit. The first test cycle completed without incident, the unit behaving exactly as it should under normal conditions. Gideon smiled and suggested Owen was simply stalling for time in front of an audience he desperately wanted to impress. Looking closer at the equipment brought in for testing, Owen noticed the serial number did not match the unit actually installed aboard Alpha 1. Gideon explained it away as an equivalent replacement model, insisting the distinction made no practical difference. Owen insisted on testing the actual Helix 9 unit removed directly from Alpha 1 rather than any substitute. The second test produced the vibration Owen expected, though no electrical fault appeared right away, and the room's tension thickened with every passing second. Several investors seated near the back began checking their phones, their patience visibly running out. Owen raised the simulated temperature to match conditions inside a sealed cabin. Shortly before takeoff, the exact circumstance Reed had described over the phone. A single circuit flickered for less than a second before stabilizing again on its own. Rowe argued the margin was too small to represent any genuine danger to the aircraft or its passengers. Owen predicted the next flicker would last roughly twice as long, and when the equipment repeated the cycle moments later, it happened exactly as he described. Removing the protective housing revealed the cracked contact terminal underneath, precisely where Owen had said it would be. For a moment, nobody in the hangar spoke at all, the silence stretching long enough that the hum of the overhead lighting became the loudest sound in the room. One of the younger engineers leaned in for a closer look, comparing the hairline crack against a diagram pulled up on a nearby tablet, his expression shifting from professional detachment to something closer to alarm. Rowe rubbed the back of his neck and said nothing, though his earlier confidence had visibly drained from his face. Even the investors near the back of the room had stopped checking their phones, watching instead, as Owen carefully photographed the fracture from several angles for the record. Sloan stepped closer to examine it herself, turning the component slowly under the overhead light, and for the first time that evening her expression carried something other than suspicion. Sloan asked whether Owen had ever reported this defect before his departure from the company. He told her he had filed 3 separate reports demanding the batch be suspended, and that he had refused to sign off on final certification because of it. The following day, he had been dismissed for what his termination letter called failure to align with business objectives. Gideon accused Owen of rewriting history to suit his own version of events. He produced a document showing what appeared to be Owen's own signature on the final approval certifying Helix 9 safe for installation. Owen studied the signature and admitted it resembled his handwriting closely, but pointed out that the authentication code beneath it belonged to an administrative account registered under Gideon's own name. Sloan ordered the original archived records pulled immediately for comparison. Instead, the system returned a notice stating that Owen's original testing data had already been permanently deleted from company storage. Gideon insisted the deletion followed standard archival procedure and nothing more sinister than routine housekeeping. Owen knew that federal aviation regulations required safety testing records to remain on file for at least a decade, a fact Gideon seemed to have conveniently overlooked. Chief of Staff Tessa Vale reviewed the system logs herself and discovered the files had been erased only 3 days after Owen's termination, not through any scheduled process. Deletion privileges for that particular archive belonged exclusively to Gideon's Fleet Operations Office. Unable to dispute the timing, Gideon shifted his attack back toward Owen personally. He reminded the board that Owen currently owed money, performed minor repair work for a living, and had gone through a difficult divorce following his termination, framing each fact as evidence of a man motivated purely by resentment. Sloan asked Owen directly whether any of it was true. He admitted all of it without hesitation, then added that financial hardship did not put a crack in an aircraft component. Gideon offered Owen a quiet consulting payment in exchange for withdrawing his warning and confirming the defect applied only to Alpha 1 rather than the fleet as a whole. He framed it carefully, calling it a gesture of goodwill rather than a bribe, and reminded Owen that a man in his financial position would be foolish to turn down an easy resolution. Owen listened to the entire offer without interrupting, then asked Gideon plainly whether he would put the same offer in writing for the board to review. Gideon's silence answered the question more clearly than any denial could have. Owen refused the payment since the remaining 13 jets had been built using the same defective material batch, and accepting money to say otherwise would have made him no different from the men who had buried the problem in the first place. Rowe finally admitted, almost involuntarily, that Helix 9 units had also been sold and installed on aircraft belonging to outside clients beyond Carrington Crown's own fleet. If Owen was correct, dozens of unrelated aircraft around the country could be carrying the identical hidden flaw, aircraft flown by pilots who had never heard his name and would have no reason to question the paperwork sitting in front of them. Gideon pushed to limit the scope of any investigation, worried that a broader disclosure would trigger panic across the private aviation market. Owen proposed issuing a confidential, technical bulletin to every affected pilot, requiring inspection before any future flight regardless of destination. Gideon called the idea reckless and accused Owen of trying to destroy shareholder value out of spite. Watching the exchange unfold, Sloan began to understand that Gideon seemed far more concerned with stock valuation than with the safety of anyone actually seated aboard these aircraft. She thought back to the countless meetings where Gideon had presented himself as the steady hand guiding the company through growth, the man who always had a plan, always had an answer, always seemed to know exactly what the board wanted to hear before they said it themselves. It struck her now how rarely those plans had ever included a genuine conversation about risk, how consistently every safety concern raised over the years had been reframed as a delay, an inconvenience, a threat to momentum rather than a warning worth taking seriously. She said nothing of this aloud yet, unwilling to unravel her trust in a man she had worked beside for years based on a single evening, however damning the evidence appeared. Still, she found herself watching Gideon differently now, noticing the practiced calm in his voice for what it might actually be, a shield built carefully over time rather than genuine composure. Tessa located an old email buried deep in Owen's former company account, one he had sent directly to the insurance department years earlier. The timestamp on that message predated the official certification date by several weeks. In it, Owen had already warned of the exact failure pattern that had just been demonstrated in the hangar that evening. Gideon suggested the email itself could easily have been fabricated after the fact. Owen remembered that every laboratory test at the time had been simultaneously recorded onto an independent data recorder kept for insurance verification purposes. That recorder, unlike the internal archive, was not owned or controlled by Carrington Crown at all, but by the underwriting firm that insured the testing facility. Sloan immediately demanded the recorder be retrieved for review. Moments later, a staff member reported that the device had just been removed from the storage facility under Gideon's direct authorization. Gideon denied giving any such order, though his voice carried less conviction than before. While Tessa worked to trace the recorder's location, Gideon quietly pressed several board members, warning that keeping the entire fleet grounded any longer would collapse the $5.6 billion expansion deal scheduled to close within days. He proposed a compromise, allowing one aircraft that had not yet shown any fault to complete a short demonstration flight in order to reassure nervous investors. Owen objected immediately, since that aircraft used the very same Helix 9 configuration as every other jet in question. Gideon dismissed the objection outright, declaring that no repairman had the authority to dictate how a global corporation should be run. Under pressure, the board narrowly approved the demonstration flight, after Rowe signed a temporary safety clearance he clearly did not believe in himself. Sloan found herself caught between two unbearable choices: cancel the flight and risk being overruled and removed by her own board, or allow it to proceed and stake her reputation on a system already under serious suspicion. She thought of her father, who had built this company on the belief that the Carrington name meant something more than quarterly earnings, and she wondered what he would have made of a board more concerned with an investor call than with the people boarding these aircraft. Late that night, alone in her office, she called Owen directly rather than routing the decision through an assistant, something she rarely did with anyone outside her closest circle. She asked him plainly whether he believed the aircraft could fly safely under close supervision, and she listened carefully to the pause before he answered. Owen told her the honest truth was that he did not know for certain, and that anyone who claimed otherwise was guessing. What he did know was that guessing was exactly the habit that had put the fleet in danger in the first place. Sloan chose a middle path, permitting the flight only under Owen's direct supervision during final inspection, on the condition that he alone would have the authority to halt it at any point without needing anyone else's approval. While reviewing the aircraft, Owen noticed the installed power transfer unit appeared suspiciously new compared to everything else aboard. Its serial number did not appear anywhere on the original list of defective Helix 9 units Owen had helped compile years earlier. Gideon explained that the technical team had proactively swapped the component as a precaution before the flight. Tracing the wiring further back, Owen discovered the replacement had only been made at the most visible, easily inspected point in the system. A secondary controller mounted further back remained part of the original defective batch, untouched and still installed. If the demonstration flight succeeded without incident, Gideon intended to use it as proof that Owen's entire warning had been exaggerated or outright false. If something went wrong instead, He could just as easily blame Owen for having tampered with the aircraft during his supervised inspection. Owen requested the flight be halted immediately, but Rowe had already authorized departure under mounting pressure from above. Captain Reed Lawson refused outright to pilot the aircraft under those conditions. Gideon summoned a backup pilot willing to fly in Reed's place. In response, every remaining captain across the fleet declared, almost in unison, that none of them would fly any Carrington Crown aircraft until an independent investigation was completed. The image of dozens of pilots quietly setting their flight badges down on the hangar table in protest left the assembled board visibly shaken. People who had stayed silent when Owen was dismissed 2 years earlier now stood firmly behind him, finally understanding that his warning back then had been an attempt to protect them all along. Reed stood near the front of the group, watching the badges accumulate on the table one by one, each small metallic click landing louder than it had any right to. He remembered the version of Owen who used to walk these same hangars with a clipboard and a reputation for catching problems nobody else could see, and he remembered, too, how quickly the company had erased that reputation the moment it became inconvenient. Several younger pilots who had never even met Owen before that week found themselves drawn into the same quiet defiance, moved less by loyalty to him personally than by the simple, unavoidable fact that he had been right about something that mattered. Gideon looked out at the row of abandoned badges and, for the first time since the crisis began, seemed to understand that he had finally run out of people left to intimidate into silence. Moments later, Tessa's phone rang with news that the missing data recorder had been located inside the personal vehicle of a security employee who was in the process of leaving the airport grounds. The recovered recorder was brought directly into an emergency session of the board, its recorded data displayed for everyone present to examine. The files confirmed that Helix 9 had failed across 4 separate controlled tests conducted years earlier, each failure documented in precise technical detail. Owen's own recorded voice from that period could be heard clearly, requesting the entire program be suspended immediately. Gideon's voice answered on the same recording, insisting the company could not afford to lose a lucrative contract over what he called a purely theoretical probability. A separate portion of the recording captured Gideon directly instructing Rowe to alter testing conditions until the component could pass certification on paper. Rowe finally broke down in front of the board, admitting he had signed the falsified documents only after Gideon threatened his job and his pension if he refused. He described, in a voice barely above a whisper, how Gideon had called him into a private office years earlier and laid out exactly what would happen to his family's health coverage and his standing in the industry if he sided with Owen instead of leadership. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, some of them clearly recalling their own private conversations with Gideon over the years. Conversations that suddenly looked very different in this new light. Gideon still tried to hold his composure, arguing that since no accident had ever actually occurred, his decision represented nothing more than a reasonable business judgment made under pressure. He reminded the board of the revenue the Helix 9 program had generated, the contracts it had secured, and the growth it had fueled across 3 fiscal years, as though the numbers alone might still be enough to buy back the room's confidence. Owen pointed to the cracked component recovered earlier from Sloane's own aircraft, still sitting on the table in front of everyone, and asked Gideon directly whether he would have said the same thing with his own family seated in that cabin. He told the room plainly that the absence of an accident so far did not mean the equipment had ever been safe, only that the fleet had been fortunate until now. Tessa then presented evidence showing Owen's certification signature had been digitally reproduced using an administrative account that belonged entirely to Gideon. Beyond falsifying records, Gideon had also quietly placed Owen's name on an informal do-not-hire list shared among several industry partners. Owen's ruined career had never been an accident or a simple business decision at all, but a deliberate act of retaliation carried out after he refused to stay silent. Sloan asked how Gideon could justify doing something like that under the Carrington family name. He answered that he had been protecting the empire from people too weak, in his view, to understand the true value of speed and profit in a competitive industry. Sloan suspended Gideon from his position immediately, her voice steady despite the anger clearly beneath it. Gideon laughed bitterly and told her the board would ultimately choose profit over her leadership when the final vote came. Adrian Bancroft, representing the company's largest institutional investor, turned decisively against Gideon the moment he understood the personal legal liability he might face for allowing a known defect to remain in service. He reminded the board, in a tone considerably sharper than his usual measured delivery, that every signature on that falsified paperwork now carried the weight of a federal investigation, and that protecting Gideon any longer would only widen the circle of responsibility. Other board members who had quietly supported Gideon throughout the crisis began distancing themselves as well, their earlier confidence evaporating the moment personal accountability entered the conversation. The vote, when it finally came, was nearly unanimous, and Gideon's expression hardened into something closer to disbelief than anger as the tally was read aloud. The board voted to formally remove Gideon from his position and suspend Rowe pending further review of his conduct. Tessa transferred every piece of recovered evidence directly to federal aviation safety regulators before the end of the day. Carrington Crown issued an emergency notice to every client who had ever purchased or installed a Helix 9 unit, regardless of relationship to the company's own fleet. Gideon was escorted out through the same hangar where dozens of pilots had gathered earlier that day. As he passed Owen, he muttered that he was still nothing more than an unemployed repairman who had gotten lucky. Owen replied quietly that luck was only relevant when a plane never fell from the sky, and that stopping it from ever leaving the ground in the first place was simply responsibility. The man the company had once erased from its records had become the only person in the building qualified to guide the inspection of every aircraft they owned. Before the day ended, Sloan granted Owen temporary authority over fleet-wide safety coordination, placing him directly above several executives who had mocked him openly only hours earlier. In the weeks that followed, Carrington Crown Aviation voluntarily kept its entire fleet grounded while every Helix 9 unit was located and thoroughly inspected. The defective components were removed fleet-wide, and the recall eventually extended to outside operators who had purchased the same faulty parts. No accident had ever occurred, but inspectors confirmed that several additional units elsewhere had already begun forming the same early hairline cracking Owen described. His original warning, once dismissed as the ranting of a bitter former employee, had prevented what safety officials later called a serious and entirely foreseeable risk to passengers and crew alike. The company issued a public apology acknowledging that Owen had been wrongfully dismissed and unfairly placed on an industry blacklist without cause. Offers from competing aviation firms began arriving within days, each one eager to bring his expertise onto their own safety programs. Sloan instead offered him a newly created position as Director of Technical Integrity for Carrington Crown itself, a role built specifically around everything he had proven that week. Owen did not accept immediately, uneasy about being handed a title that might look, to outsiders, like simple compensation for what the company had put him through. He asked instead for a formal, competitive selection process, along with a specific set of conditions attached to the position itself. Safety oversight would need to operate completely independent of revenue targets and sales pressure from above. No executive would ever again be permitted to alter or delete a technical safety report once it had been filed. Pilots and engineers would retain the right to halt any operation without fear of retaliation or quiet blacklisting afterward. Every safety warning filed going forward would be archived outside the reach or control of company leadership entirely. Finally, every employee Gideon had quietly blacklisted over the years would receive a fair, independent review of their record. Sloan agreed to every condition without hesitation and asked her legal team to draft the new safety charter that same week, determined not to let the moment pass once the initial urgency faded. Owen went through the full evaluation process like any other candidate, sitting through the same technical panels and background reviews required of anyone applying for the role. Several board members who had watched him work that first chaotic night still pushed for an expedited appointment, but Owen insisted on the longer process himself, wanting no one, including himself, to ever question whether he had earned the position or simply been handed it. He earned it on merit alone, not out of pity or public relations necessity, and the distinction mattered enormously to him in a way few people in that boardroom fully understood. 6 months later, Owen held steady, meaningful work for the first time in years. His overdue rent long since paid in full. He no longer spent his nights rushing between repair calls just to make ends meet before dawn. He kept the old photograph from his truck's glove compartment, but now it sat framed on a desk inside an office with his own name printed on the door, a small detail that still caught him off guard some mornings. The engineers who once looked away from him in the hallway now sought him out directly, bringing him early findings and half-formed concerns instead of burying them the way the old culture had trained them to. His daughter Laurel visited the hangar one afternoon, curious about the place her father now spent so much of his time. She asked whether he was really the one who had ordered every single aircraft to stay grounded that day. Owen told her he never had the authority to give orders to anyone at all. He had simply told the truth, and enough pilots that day had been brave enough to actually listen to it. Laurel considered this for a moment, then asked what would have happened if nobody had picked up the phone that evening. Owen admitted he thought about that question often, and that it was part of why he had insisted every future warning be recorded somewhere. No single person could quietly erase it again. Sloan, standing nearby, gently corrected him, saying that speaking truth to people holding real power was, in its own quiet way, a form of leadership too. Laurel looked between the two adults with the particular skepticism only a 13-year-old could summon, then declared that grown-ups made everything sound more complicated than it needed to be. Owen laughed, the first easy laugh Sloan had heard from him since the night this entire ordeal began, and for a moment the weight the past 2 years had placed on his shoulders seemed to lift just slightly. The respect and trust between Owen and Sloan had grown steadily since that first chaotic evening, leaving room for something more to develop between them in time, though neither rushed to name it. On the morning of the fleet's first flight since the full inspection concluded, Owen stood inside the operations center rather than in any luxury cabin reserved for executives. He listened carefully to the engine readings streaming through the monitoring system, the same kind of sound that had once cost him everything. Every reading held steady and well within normal range. Captain Reed Lawson requested clearance for departure, his voice calm and certain over the radio. Owen watched the entire fleet displayed across the monitors in front of him before finally confirming that every system checked out safely. He thought briefly of the phone call that had started all of this, the strange, half-doubted feeling of hearing a familiar voice ask him to listen one more time to something no one else could hear. He thought, too, of Laurel waiting for him at home that evening, no longer wondering whether the rent would be paid or whether her father would make it back in time for dinner. One by one, the aircraft rolled forward, and lifted off the runway into the open sky. They did not fly that morning because any executive had forced them into the air, and they did not fly because a board vote demanded it or a contract required it. They flew because, for the first time in a long while, everyone in that building finally understood that the person brave enough to say stop would always be heard.
There we go. Damn. Thank you, Trench. What if I'm in the next ball set? Let's get it. Damn. Oh, these guys got some... Whoa. Wow. Oh, wow. Here we go. I need to heal.